Hey everyone, I'm Adrian Battle Marston, and this is another episode of TU Stories.
When Teresa and I conceived of this event, we hope for it to be a fireside chat sort of feel. So we hope you'll engage. We'll hope you feel comfortable to ask questions, maybe about service, curiosities about that. Feel free to ask about writing. Um, Teresa is an amazing writer and very much enjoyed the memoir. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Dario. I'm with the Military and Veteran Center, along with my colleague Toby, who provide outstanding support services to veterans and their family members. Thank you to Adrian, Office of the Inclusion and Institutional Equity, for being our partner on this, and happy to welcome Teresa Fazio today. You know what? I've never actually asked your last name. How to say it? Is that correct?
It's funny. Yes, there's two different ways actually. My family says it. So, and that's one of them. That's the like more Italian way.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. I'm from the New York area, and so sometimes like I grew up saying Fazio because like that's sort of a New York accent kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But different members of my family say it the same way, and like even my brothers and I, our pronunciation has changed throughout our lifetime. So Fazio works totally fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
Who I have the pleasure of introducing. She was a Marine Corps communication officer for 4 years, deploying once to Iraq. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Foreign Policy, and The Nation, as well as in the anthologies Retire the Colors, Veterans and Civilians on Iraq and Afghanistan, The Road Ahead, Fiction from the Forever War, and It's My Country Too, Women's Military Stories from the American Revolution to Afghanistan. Teresa holds a BS in Physics from MIT, a PhD in Materials, a PhD from Columbia University, and an MFA from Bennington Writing Seminars. So, welcome here today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So, the first question relates to how did you come to your decision to write your story? But I guess that's really who are you and what brings you here, right?
Sure. Well, that's an enormous question that could take far more time than we have. So, but I guess I can talk about sort of the journey of getting out of the Marine Corps and like beginning to write my story. And so I actually didn't start writing it until, gosh, 6 or so years after I deployed, even longer maybe. And so I got off deployment, served another 2 years in California, and then got out of the Marine Corps entirely and went immediately to grad school, and did an entirely different like graduate degree having nothing to do with my service. And only then, like 5 years after getting off active duty, did I finally feel like the emotional distance to be able to like write down some things about what had happened in Iraq. And at first I thought, well, okay, I'll just write some short stories. I'll write some fiction about it. And maybe, that'll be enough. And suddenly, I was like, oh, I can't write about this, some of the things that happened over there. I can't write about like all this gore. I can't write about, like this illicit relationship I had while deployed. Like, no. And then suddenly that stuff was all I could write about. And I was like, oh no. And I finally started, instead of fiction, just made it nonfiction and made a timeline of my experience over there. And everything just sort of came pouring out in torrents. And so it wasn't really a conscious decision. Like writing is how I process my life experience. Like I've frequently kept a journal and stuff. And so if you can process your life experience literally any other way than writing a highly personal memoir and publishing it, I would recommend that other way because it's a lot of, to just sort of excavate in there. But it took a long time and a lot of growth and, therapy, frankly, to be comfortable with like actually publishing it and like sharing my story. It took a lot of effort.
Were there outcomes you were hoping as far as writing it? It occurs to me, if you want to write for yourself, you can write whatever you want. But the decision to write and publish kind of makes you force about audience, impact, where it's going to go and why. Did you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah. So, there's a difference between writing as therapy and writing as art, right? And so like there are definitely like narrative therapy like programs and curricula, and they're incredibly useful and helpful and cathartic for a lot of people. And at first, as I was writing this stuff and like not sharing it with anybody, like it was cathartic for me, and that was really great. But that wasn't, maybe subconsciously that's why I was doing it, but I guess the real reason was just like maybe ego, I don't know, just to see my work out there, to see some form of writing out there. And then it became like sort of nobody ever talks about experiences like I had. At the time that I was writing and even starting to publish, like women veteran stories weren't getting out a lot. And so I wanted there to be more diversity in the types of stories that were getting out there. And after my very first article was published, and it happened to be in the New York Times, which was kind of a whopper of a like very first thing ever to have published, like, kind of like landing a big fish, which was amazing. And also like terrifying because, like published in the Times was like, oh my, like I hadn't told my family any of this story either. And I told very, very few friends. And so I was like, at first it's like, oh, well, what if like nobody reads it? And like, oh no, what if they do? And then I was like, meh, my dad doesn't read the Times. And then I was like, but my grandma does. I found out on her iPad, and she was amazing. She has since passed away. But so dealing with that, it was just kind of like ripping the Band-Aid off a lot of things that I had kept secret. And I guess maybe subconsciously that was the intention. But the biggest response I got, and the most like meaningful and powerful one, which convinced me that publishing a book might on some distant planet like be a good idea, was that people kept saying like I would share my experience and like be really terrified they would judge and hate me, right? And the most powerful thing was them saying, well, actually, no, I had an experience like that. Or Me Too, which is a whole movement and has been for years now. This was a few years, a decade before that. But yeah, so that was really the most powerful thing. That commonality. I started getting Facebook messages from like people I'd served with. I didn't know like things that privately, they had gone through. And they would come out of the woodwork and tell me. And I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, sharing our stories and that shared veteran narrative, as diverse as all of our narratives are, weaving that tapestry together can be really powerful.
Related to that, what more would you like to say, or might you want to say, about the challenge of owning your power and developing the confidence to be your authentic self?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? So, going through lots of things during childhood and college and the Marine Corps, like I kept having very intense experiences no matter what. And my way of dealing with those intense or traumatic experiences was to build a lot of walls and to very tightly regulate like what I did. And joining the military is terrific for that if you've gone through trauma as a kid, because like everything's regulated, there's a protocol for everything, and you're really used to dealing with like people yelling at you and intense experiences, and like you don't freak out when things are going completely bananas because you're used to it. It turns out this is not really the way to have a satisfying life, which I found out the hard way. So I think deprogramming myself from a lot of that and finding the courage to be vulnerable, which took both making good friends who would like sort of like me for me and not for anything I was doing for them or not doing for them, getting help. And I made good friends actually with in graduate school with another student who happened to be also an Army officer. They had the Army had sent him to grad school to get a master's so he could go back and like teach physics at West Point. And, military people can kind of like pick each other out of a room a lot of times, like vets. And, he was obvious about it and stuff. But, he had gone through a personally challenging time too, around the same time I was. And he looks at me and he's like, hey, dude, like you're miserable. Like go talk to somebody. And veterans don't always like do that. A lot of times there's like the stigma of like, no, I don't go seek help, or like I've got to go be tough, or I've got to be perfect. Yeah. And just deprogramming myself of that gave me a little bit of space to like show some vulnerability, have some human interaction, to the point where eventually years later, like I could put that down on the page.
You kind of gleaned about it a little bit, but some in the audience might not understand military culture better than others. And even within the military, you have different paradigms of expectations between the services. The Marine Corps in particular having a very sort of military culture. May I ask for you to explain, make some connections, elucidate the audience on that?
Sure, yeah. Some of this is, so I went to officer candidate school. A lot of people, if you're enlisted, you go to boot camp. And it is anywhere from 6 to 13 weeks of just like people screaming at you a lot and you having to, perform very rote actions extremely quickly and, memorize a lot of things. And part of that ethos of training is like over-functioning, doing as much as you can, as fast as you can, with as little sleep as possible, and also never seeking help. like overfunctioning for the people to your left and your right, but for yourself, there's this this ethos of, unless it's a sucking chest wound, like you've got things sticking out of your chest and you can't breathe, like you never go see the corpsman, like the military, medic.
Yeah.
And it's, so we'd have people at OCS developing like cellulitis infections or like serious bronchitis, or like the woman who I slept on the top bunk, which is laughable since I'm 5'1", but my rack mate was even shorter than me and slept on the bottom bunk. She wound up like separating a hamstring on some of the hikes we were doing and was like limping the whole way. And it was like, no, I'm fine. It's like Monty Python, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not dead yet. I feel much better, really. No, really. And so that follows you around, and it makes you, when you get rewarded for this, you think, well, oh, that's normal, and I have to, appear as perfect as possible and do everything for everybody around me. And, because on a battlefield, really, that is helpful for the few hours to days of an actual, firefighter military battle, which literally ends when either you survive or you die. That's not the way to function in everyday life, right? And, that distinction is something that a lot of us, either never make in the first place or forget when we get out. So.
You write about your own battles in your book, Fidelis, and we do have copies for anybody who wants them. You write about your own battles against shame and how you often resorted to wearing masks of anger or silent compliance to cultivate a warrior image. What did your Marine Corps experiences teach you about how gendered shame is used to establish hierarchies and maintain a very binary power structure?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. I might break that down in a few different ways. So some of it is, I talked about like the overfunctioning and the just the have to be perfect, have to do everything, have to like grind myself into the ground to the point of burnout, and that's normal, right?
Yeah.
And so the masks that you wear during that is either, people pleasing, like say yes to everybody. Somebody asks you to do something, you just sort of take that as an order and like, well, I guess I have to do that now, right? So it's the never complaining sort of ethos, which, when people are yelling at you in boot camp or like you have to get a mission accomplished, and you can't sleep till it's done, is understandable, but it's not really a great way even to get along in garrison, like on the base back in the States, right? You have to draw boundaries, and like I really was not good at that at all. And so work-life balance was a huge challenge. That was really difficult, and I was pretty burnt out for probably years, and had a tendency towards burnout. So that is the part. Okay, so that was part of the question. Silent compliance. Oh, or anger, right? So this is the other thing they train you in, right? So this whole, kind of boot camp, officer candidate school ethos of like, you're not allowed to feel things, right? Or you got to keep a tight lid on that.
Yeah.
And they're training you for like occasions where you might have to keep a tight lid on that. But again, it's no way to go through everyday life. So the only emotion that really it's sort of quote unquote acceptable to show is rage. And they're literally training you for war, so that makes some sort of sense, but you have to let go the pressure valve eventually. And this is why like warrior transition can be so difficult. I do write a lot about gendered shame in the book, and from growing up to the teenage years to being in the Marine Corps, it is now, I think, when I was in, it was like about 7% female, so 93% male. Now it is, I think, something like 9% female, so still, very few women compared to very many men. So, many things default to just like a masculine default. There's also like sort of the gendered power structure of like the warrior ethos historically among humans has been like mostly masculine. And so if you're a woman, they're like, well, what can you do? Can you like run as fast or be as strong? Or I was in a communications occupational specialty, which was great because it meant like I'm small and nerdy. They had no like illusions about me, but I'm really nerdy. So I was pretty good at my job. And so like being smart enough to, run the comm systems and throw down and solve problems in that way, like earned me professional respect. And that was quite useful. I also specifically, consciously or not, it was probably not very conscious at the time, dialed down my femininity, which had the effect of like people wouldn't hit on me, which meant I was safe, which meant I was respected. Again, this is a way to, in a pinch, get through a war. This is not actually a good or healthy way for somebody to be in the world, like in the civilian world afterwards trying to date. And, not in the military world either. Like women have historically walked this razor's edge between like, oh, well, if you're too feminine, you're going to get hit on and the men won't respect you. But if you're too masculine, I write about this in the book, and I've said it at other public events, so forgive me, but at Officer Candidate School, we were coached and actually told by our sergeant instructors, if you're a woman in the Marine Corps, you're either a bitch, a dyke, or a hoe. And, pick one of the three. And I guess, like, the default least bad thing you could be was maybe a bitch, but those three aren't great options, and they really pigeonhole people. The option I defaulted to was like everybody's kid sister who was like kind of funny, and that works for a little bit until you actually have to take power about something. And I got off of active duty as a first lieutenant. I was promoted to captain in the individual ready reserve, so I was able to lead troops and stuff, but I always had people around and over me. And so if I had been, say, a company commander or something like that and had to really use power, I don't know how that would have gone for me, to be honest with you. I would have had to, draw stronger boundaries and been more forceful. And that might have been really hard. That might not have worked. I'll never know. But, yeah.
So, a lot of stuff in your experience, a lot of challenges in the military. You mentioned why you chose to write your story, but what was the role of choosing that as far as processing your experiences?
Let's see, choosing to write my story as far as processing my experiences. Can you elaborate? Like, what effect did it have processing my experiences?
Did this help with resilience?
Oh, resilience, yes. So, yeah. There's, resilience in so many different ways, right? So I guess so we talk about resilience, and trauma, I think, is in there in that question too, right?
Yeah.
So I like to quote a 2014 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they compared adverse childhood experiences, which in like the trauma research realm are things like parental incarceration, parental divorce, parental mental illness, like things you experience as a really small kid, poverty, like living below the poverty line, parental death, things like that, big losses a kid can have, right? Abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, etc. And they compared the all-volunteer military to the draft military. Now, they didn't have numbers about women in the draft military, so they just compared like timelines. And they found that at least among the men in the all-volunteer military, they were way more likely to have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, which is like pretty traumatizing upbringing.
Yeah.
And more likely to join the military in order to, claim power, in order to have structure. Oftentimes, the effect this has is like compounding trauma. And so coming out of the military, like you have to sort of deconvolve all of that stuff, but like even more because you've tried to like solve something traumatic with something that could be even more traumatic.
Yeah.
Which is some of the experience I had too, and really had to dial that back. So in terms of resilience, some of the writing helped in that it was like, a room just like this, and there would be between like, 4 and a dozen other military vets, and we'd all be writing things. Actually, NYU had a veterans writing workshop. Perhaps they still do. In New York, they have Voices from War. They had Words After War, which is now online. And so that community was incredibly helpful. I joke that, the movie Fight Club, where he goes around to like all of the cancer support groups, right? I was like that, but with veterans writing groups for like years in New York City. I was just like, oh, okay, 3 a week, cool. We're doing this now, great. And just like kept throwing myself at sharing that story and sharing writing and honing writing and things like that. And the first time I walked into a room full of other vets and like shared a piece of, like, I was absolutely terrified. I thought they would judge me. I thought they would hate me and be like, what are you doing here? But they were so cool and thoughtful and respectful. And that was amazing. That was really healing. And, through that met you and, some other vet writers that I'm still friends with today. And yeah, a really fantastic community. So that's been huge in building resilience is finding a community too.
Sure, no doubt. That's why
we're
we have
here.
Jobs on a college campus.
Yeah.
we have overwhelming data and firsthand empirical evidence of how much community matters.
Yeah, no, connection. So actually, if I could put in a plug, the blurb on the front of my book is from a Journal of Veteran Studies article, and it was actually written by my dear friend, Dr. Kate Hendricks-Thomas, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year from breast cancer. It was gained from toxic exposure during her military service. She was in Fallujah. But what Kate wrote, her very first book was called Brave, Strong, and True, which is all about resilience in the military. And she wrote about connection, and she wrote about finding spirituality, however you would define that. It could be nature, it could be, mainstream Christianity, Judaism, Islam, whatever. But she writes a lot about that, and I'm just putting in a plug for her stuff at this event too.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your reasons for writing, how it provided resilience, and you started to discuss a little bit about some of the reactions you were getting to your writing. It seems to me, again, your experience being such a niche one, be even just the very act of being a woman in the Marine Corps and just the proportion of men to women. But it seems to me one impact of putting the writing out there that way is connection people don't have with those experiences, people with non-military experiences. In what ways have you seen your writing or literature in general gap what some people call military-civilian divide?
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the first questions, I've been having the same conversation since I was 18 years old, I feel like, because people, I'd be in college and people would be like, oh, you're here, like, cool, you're doing ROTC? And I'm like, yes, to pay for college. And the next question invariably would be like, what's it like to be a woman in the Marine Corps? I'm like, this again. And there's multiple different ways to be a woman in the world, full stop. And so bringing those different ways of being a woman, to bear in any military service, it's important to realize, like, just the diversity of experiences even different people in one minority group might have. So in terms of, the veterans community and how that's working, like, what I'd love to see is more writing from, like, folks of color, folks of different sexual orientations, folks in occupational specialties that maybe are not the mainstream, right? So, like, after Iraq and Afghanistan, like, the early years of the war, we got, like, okay, white male combat vet, like, another fiction book about them, another memoir about them. Got it. Cool. Okay. It's like lots and lots of the American Sniper narrative. Now you're seeing more women's memoirs come out. Now you're seeing at least a few more folks of color publish their stuff. I would love to see more. Chris Wolfe is a phenomenally talented author. He lives in Brooklyn. Maurice DeCall is a phenomenally talented poet and playwright, both African-American gentlemen in the New York area. They're amazing. I just love to see more narratives out there. Oh, Nicole Goodwin, she's a poet too and a performance artist, African-American in the New York area. They're just cool as hell, and I would, love to see more diversity from all sorts of, races and genders and sexual orientations there. So I think that just gives the audience a much broader idea of, like, the military really is a cross-section of America, and the stories that had been getting out, at least until recently, were, like, dominated by, like, straight white men. And, like, they have stories too, cool, but we need more.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
What impacts have you seen with people with non-military backgrounds engaging with these sorts of works?
Yeah. So I've seen a lot, especially at book events, people will come up to me and say, my brother served or my dad served, or in some cases, like, actually an old roommate of mine who's still in the Marine Corps featured this in her book club full of military spouses. And I was like, dude, what are you doing? There's just, like, some, sketchy stuff in the book that goes on in deployment. And I'm like, they're all going to hate me. And actually they were like, thank you so much for writing this. Like, now I know what happens on a deployment. Yeah. My husband doesn't talk about it. Thank you for, like, showing me, like, things he might have seen or things he might have done or, like, experiences he might have had or, the sights and smells and sounds of Iraq in the mid-aughts, right? They had no idea. So, getting that word out in a format and with a plot line that, more folks might read or different folks might read, I think has been an interesting reaction, totally one I did not expect. So that's been really cool, actually, getting, like, family members or people curious about it, interested.
So another question we had discussed about a little bit before our Q&A, fireside chat we're having here, but a little bit kind of off the focus we've had is what does service, love of country mean? What do you want to see more of when people write about life in the service or women in the service?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think service is really important as a concept for like citizenship, right? And I would love to see national service, but not necessarily in a military sense. Like, not every person needs to or really should join the military. But everybody, I think, could stand to volunteer more or help out with, like, their community or in a scout troop or with the elderly or at a soup kitchen. And so I think, you know, in American civil society, like, more civic engagement would be really good. The biggest thing I took away from deployment was not some sort of like grand loyalty to some higher cause or like political ethos or anything like that. It was just driven home to me the importance of the people to my left and to my right at any given time. Like, if I'm, you know, from something as dorky as keeping watch over a network with somebody, and, you know, if we're both like really competent or both have each other's backs when we have to take care of other things, like, that's what's going to accomplish the mission. You know, if they tell you it's driven into you, like, go somewhere with a buddy, right? That drive towards community is incredibly important. And so I think that's really what patriotism is like a love of community and a belief in the strength of the American people as a whole to like come together. In terms of what I'd love to see from what did you ask, writing or just in general?
What do you want to see more of when people write about life in service or women in service?
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, more diversity would be fantastic. I think I talked about that in the last question. There has also been, and clearly I'm guilty of it, but a lot of stock placed in like the trauma memoir or like the bad things happen memoir recently. And I get it, like, right, I did that too. There's other, you know, stories of like the anti-heroes coming home, right? We have all these hero narratives. Now we're starting to have the anti-hero narratives of troops who get home and they're like, they're in a lot of trouble, or they get in legal trouble, or they do a bunch of drugs, or they have a bunch of substance issues. And that is also very true and like needs to be dealt with, like the mental health crises, right? But I would also love to see a celebration of like all the funny stuff that happens on deployment. 'Cause like there's a lot of it. Like, you put a bunch of like 18 to 24-year-olds in a room together, or like in an aircraft or on a submarine or in a marine, like, oh my gosh, my Marines did the funniest stuff. A lot of it got cut from the memoir, unfortunately, because it didn't drive the plot. But yeah. I mean, you know the things, Marines. It's like we send children to war, which is heartbreaking. On the other hand, you put a bunch of teenagers in a place, like, they're going to do all sorts of fun things. So that I miss. I should write more about that stuff. Yeah, I miss those guys sometimes. Like, that was hands down the best part of the Marine Corps, was having troops. I have 3 younger brothers in real life. This was like having 35 of them in a desert with weapons. So yeah, they were absolutely wonderful folks. So
I make the joke all the time, and I say this as a Marine. Our Marines would be the students if they chose college instead of the Marine Corps, who would often be getting in trouble in the residence halls. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like, endlessly creative. Like, and sometimes, like, your best operators, right, are the ones who get in the most trouble back home. So even back home, like, you know, I'd come out of my office and be like, what are we doing, Marines? And they'd be like, cage fighting in Tijuana, ma'am. I'm like, no. Like, I'm going to go back in my office. I'm going to come out again. You're going to tell me something different, right? Yeah. So it's, I would love to see more sharing of stories like that.
What's been happening since the book? How's the impact?
Yeah.
How's the connection? It came out during a pandemic. I mean, I'm curious to know about your journey now. What happened with this, and what's next?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. So, yeah, it was, I guess, unusual, maybe unprecedented, doing a Zoom book tour when your book comes out during the pandemic. So, but also, I mean, this, you know, deals with highly personal and some difficult stuff. So I was telling you even before the event started, like, it, you know, was almost a blessing that I had to do a Zoom book tour instead of like the big cathartic, emotional, like in-person hardcover book tour. But this is the paperback, which is just out this fall. So have at it. So that's been really exciting. The other thing too, I mean, you know, I've had an interesting, weird pandemic, but moved to a different state. So I live in the Boston area now. And in terms of the stuff I'm writing about now, a slightly convoluted story, but bear with me. One of the hobbies I have, which I have written about, I've got an article in the New York Times about it from a while ago by now, 2018 probably, about skateboarding, because I do skateboard not particularly well, but I have for the past, I don't know, 20 years at least, and really since I was a kid. And I skateboarded in Iraq. There's stuff in the book about it, which was fun. Again, funny things Marines do, right? Like the troops just trying to build skate ramps and stuff. A buddy of mine sent me a board. And so one of the socially distant but still social things one could do in the Boston area during the pandemic was skateboard. And it turns out that Boston skaters are like really nice, which I did not expect. But they're super cool. And so there's a giant skate park under a big old bridge in Boston that I started going to. And I'm like not young now anymore. I like time only moves in one direction, it turns out. And so I pulled a calf muscle at one point and like made some crack to the guy next to me about being old. And he was like, "Wait, you're old? I'm old too. How old are you?" And I'm like, this is weird. Nobody ever talks to me at the skate park. But it turns out he's a photographer. Like, you know, he works a day job like many artists, but has lectured and taught photography at universities and takes pictures, and has been working on an art book about skateboarding and skateboarding as an older person, because like we're in our 40s now, which is scary. But him and his buddies who he skates with are like all, you know, like married dads now in their 40s. And weirdly, through this crazy twist of fate, they're all Air Force brats who grew up on Hanscom Air Force Base.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I'm like doing kind of words for this it's still like a concept and stuff at this point, but I'm doing words and he's doing pictures. And so I'm hoping to write more about like midlife crises and skateboarding. Like everybody's trying to have a midlife crisis in the healthiest possible way. You know, cause I mean, I've been out of the Marine Corps since 2006, right? So it's, you know, I met a second lieutenant this past year. Like literally I'm old enough to be his mom. Like I feel like for our generation, you know, we should pass the mic a bit and let the younger folks write about the veteran stuff. And I don't know, I guess I'm writing about aging now. So that's short answer to your question. It's less glamorous, I think, than like all the deployments and the weapons and things.
I hope this is not a heady or challenging question, but along the sense of time just moving forward, what about your experience really stays with you?
Yeah, I mean, some good things, some bad things. Some things like trauma and reactions to it will probably stay with me in some form or another for the rest of my life. There's this really great quote from a movie that might be The Invisible War, which is a difficult movie to watch, but it's from a young woman, I believe Sailor. And she says, you don't get over it, you get on with it.
Yeah.
And so just like learning to live with like something might always be an ache or like manifest as an issue, you know, in many different scenarios of my life in the following years. And I'll just need to learn to like sit with it and move through it and just get on with life better. So developing resilience, I think, is going to have to be a skill that I'll need to practice, you know, until I die, like we all do. But that's a big thing.
I'd like to open it up. Got some English students here. We got some vets, some who work with vets. What questions do you have for Teresa? I've known her long enough to know she's very friendly, and she will answer anything very kindly. I hope.
Yeah, no, I will do my best. You guys all seem great. So. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Christopher Belgica. I'm curious to know about your college experience post-military when you went to grad school. Because at least for me, I got out E5, and my first few classes in my first semester, it was very strange. You know, everybody was just like so young, and there was a part of me, like the sergeant part of me, that wanted to, I don't know, just like have everything in order. Of course, I have to remind myself that I'm a civilian, so I'm curious to know your experience.
Yeah, very similar actually. So I started as a teaching assistant. So, you know, when you're a first year grad student, you have to help teach classes to like sort of pay your rent and whatever. And it turns out undergrads don't salute, which I kind of was really frustrating. It took an adjustment. Like I was probably like the mean TA for like a long time. It was difficult. I probably felt like, you know, really tense and uptight and just from both directions. So like I was frustrated. Mostly I was a grad student and I was frustrated about like the extremely young undergrads. My classmates I thought were really nice, but you know, it took me a while to make friends, to be able to like trust enough. They were all like almost all 4 years younger than me. There were a few that were older than me. There was that Army guy I mentioned. There were a few Israelis who had also served in the Israeli military and were older, and you know, they were great too. but yeah, it took a little while to make friends and feel like I had stuff in common with them. Eventually I did. Eventually, the guys in my grad department, I became close friends with like their girlfriends, now their wives. So that's really cool. But yeah, it took a while. I also moved, from beautiful, lovely San Diego to New York City, and the sheer volume and just energy and stuff, that took at least a full year to get used to living in like constant sirens and things like that. I'm pretty sure I've lost like frequencies of hearing also. Not from the Marine Corps, but just living in the city and stuff. Yeah, and what else about grad school? Oh, also getting out of the mindset of, doing a PhD is you're supposed to be conducting scientific inquiry, right? Like with the research and coming up with your own like problems and avenues of inquiry and like new things you want to learn. And instead I'd go to my advisor and be like, just tell me what to do. Because in the military, that's what happens. He's like, no, that's not what this is about. Like, you've got to figure out what to do. So it felt for a long time like I was constantly failing. A lot of my engineering work was in a clean room where like things would break all the time, or like the point is you make something that's really tiny and then you need to break it to be able to observe it. And I found that really frustrating too, because it felt like failure over and over and over again. And it took almost the entire 5 years of my PhD, and then I finally started treating it as craft and like, oh, this is like it would be if it were like woodworking or something like that. Okay, I'll treat it like that, where like failure is part of the learning process. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to learn that, but there it is, and that was really helpful also. But yeah, it took some time to, just not be frustrated by folks who seemed less mature. I mean, they were less mature, they were younger, and also seemed out of touch with the things I had experienced because they hadn't experienced them themselves.
I did have one. You said that a few of your memories were cut, some of the more fun, fonder ones.
Yeah.
I'd love if you could share some of your funniest moments when you were deployed.
Oh man, I just got a filter for the clean ones. One of them I can share that like did make it in the. It's just at the top of my head now. I was like flipping through it earlier and came across this one, but there's some of the Marines in technical control who were like comparatively senior enlisted and like really funny. So they were, for the vets, and like they were like E6s, E7s, and super smart. And these were, there's like too smart for their own good, get caught. And then there's too smart for their own good, don't get caught. And these guys were more on the like way really smart, side of things, and also really good at their jobs. And so I don't know how they did this. They had a set of darts. They made a dartboard, and they put all sorts of like troubleshooting procedures on it, like, prank call systems control, or like blame the lieutenant, blame the distant end. And so that was like the troubleshooting dartboard for, oh, something's broken, something went wrong. Cool, we'll just throw these darts. All of the silly things my Marines did, they'd like capture beetles and stick them like in a water bottle and like try to, make them fight. They'd have water fights. I don't know how they did this. They got a grill that was made of like an oil drum, and out of nowhere suddenly they were grilling steaks. And I'm like, what did you? And then they were like, you want some? I'm like, yeah, I do. Like had like shish kebab. I had no idea how that happened. I'm not going to ask. I still haven't asked. I'd rather not know, but yeah, that was funny. Filtering for the clean ones, but yeah, no, they were a good bunch.
I have a memory that popped to mind, and it's funny. Being a vet, often people ask about the experience, and to me, one of like the most authentic experiences as far as cinema is the movie Jarhead, inspired by the memoir, and that doesn't really sync up with people because they're like, I thought everybody who served is like really stoic and patriotic and like really truly loves their country and is super professional. But again, it's young men and women in a place very far away with all sorts of pent up aggression. And in that movie, like they have like a dance party. Somebody's running around half naked with like a Santa hat around Christmas. But I remember one time I lived in an abandoned railroad station in the middle of nowhere. This is 2004. There's a lot going on. It's a very high frequency of combat operations, and we'd come back, and one night somebody just started making animal sounds, and then everybody else just started making animal sounds, and probably for an hour it was just animal sounds. And it sounds ridiculous, and it was, but it was just like this like psychological reaction of just like pent up stress and energy that just needed to get out somehow. Yeah.
that totally.
Which is really
makes
weird to
sense.
say out loud, but like, yeah, that happened.
I could definitely picture that happening.
Yeah.
The Santa hat that we told.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. The Army left behind a Santa costume. I don't know how, but like, yeah, the Marines started wearing the Santa costume. The dance party
Yeah.
thing, like, so Hey Ya by Outkast was out the year I was deployed, so that was a thing. It was like 4 a.m. on systems control watch. It would be like, all right, Syscon dance party, and like you play Hey Ya and like people dance around. I'm a bad dancer, so I didn't like actually do that, but I observed it. And oh, speaking of the dance, yeah, so kids could like rave at Marines. So I'm small and somewhat quiet, and so I was famous for just sort of sneaking into where they were working, and catching them at doing like silly things. And so I walk in, and there's one kid like raving with like glow sticks, and he's got like Twizzlers stuck up his nose. So that happened. You mentioned earlier you were a musician. Same Marine was a musician and had dropped out of college on September 12th, 2001 to join the Marine Corps. And he was a maintenance Marine. He had taught like so many members of the platoon to play guitar while we were deployed. And that was pretty amazing. So they would like sneak things into the Embark shipment. It's almost 20 years later now, so I could like tell you. That, like guitars, one guy snuck a unicycle in there. So they'd be unicycling around the communications compound like you do, I guess.
Yeah, of
And it
course.
turns out like Amazon will ship you anything while you're deployed. And so they would like order stuff on Amazon, like another unicycle. And then it was like we had a little circus. So yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
May I ask, this is more about your interpersonal relationships. You stressed, and we know that you are encouraged to suppress your emotions in service. But did that transfer and transition to your civilian life? And how did that manifest itself? Were you able to maintain healthy relationships because of the emotions that for years you've been told you should not and probably could not have to survive?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It definitely transitioned into civilian life, and it's been like an active process of like stripping away layers of masks. Like I still work at it. That's probably one of the things I will still need to work on throughout my entire life. To be fair, you know, it was a coping mechanism, a way of being in the world that I'd had since childhood. The military just like compounded it. But yeah, it's, you know, I'm able to have mostly healthy relationships now. I'm still working on some like relationships with certain members of my family and things like that, you know. I've certainly, you know, sometimes romantic relationships have been a challenge. I don't know whether that's just me or like, you know, the veteran compounding, compounding having to mask certain emotions. You know, people are different. It's still something I work on for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else about the book, military culture, writing as a activity?
I did have one more, and you
Yeah.
touched on it. It's the trauma of writing. Were you re-traumatized in the process of
Oh.
writing? I know we mentioned more resilience, but to get to that state of resilience, was it difficult and traumatizing to relive those moments that you experienced?
I didn't find it re-traumatizing, but it wasn't fun. It had the effect of being more cathartic, but so the process of writing at least the first draft of the book, I had a full-time day job, and so I would come home, and I was taking maybe at that point only 1 or 2 like writing workshops a week, maybe 1 in that first year. And so on the nights I didn't have a writing workshop, I'd come home from work and spend a few hours like reliving my deployment. And it wasn't terrible, like it wasn't the exact same experience, but it definitely like dredged up painful memories. It dredged up like fun memories and stuff like that too. I wouldn't consider it re-traumatizing, no. That was helpful for me. I've certainly, in the prepping to release the book, had to confront, you know, certain bits of trauma that I needed to like work through. It's actually a reason the Zoom book tour was probably better than an in-person one. But yeah, and that, you know, like the professional help is a really helpful thing for a lot of people. And yeah, so if you're working with a traumatized population, that's probably stuff to leverage. Yeah.
I will just add, such as it is, and I don't know if you have this experience, and your quote is accurate. Time only moves one way. Yeah, I've gone through mental health challenges. I've come out on the other side. I know that because I've been happy for a long time, and if I need therapy, I have it and I take advantage of it. I worked at a research facility for PTSD, so even though I'm not a clinician, I have a pretty good grasp of what it is because I worked with thousands of people who have it. That being said, there were traumatic experiences from so long ago that I just have a very hard time even retrieving. And I don't know if that's because I've processed it so much or if there's just the vagaries of memory with time, right? Like some of it just doesn't even feel real. Kind of like disassociation from my past. And I don't know if that's a process of becoming a writer too and just putting it so much onto the page that it just like there's a transference that happens. I don't know. Is that a weird thing to say?
I don't think it's weird. No, I mean, I think everybody processes memories differently.
Yeah.
Right? I certainly know some things, that are in the book that I found incredibly troubling either at the time or like for years afterwards, like don't bother me at all anymore. Whereas some stuff from like even longer ago are things that I'm, confronting now. And I think some of that has to do with like however one is living one's life in the present, like where those nerves might get hit or things might get touched upon.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think one quote that I have of that, and I guess this, I'll apologize to the videographer for the F-bomb, but spoiler, is actually a quote from Greg Laswell, who's this amazing guitarist and musician, and he wrote the soundtrack, or at least one of his songs was used in the movie Taking Chance, which is about Marine Corps casualty assistance officer. And I went to a concert of his in New York because like I found his music through this movie, and he was about to play this song, and he was like, I just want to tell you about this. This is about like a relationship I had a long time ago, and I was just thinking about that the other day, and I was like, wow, that is definitely over. And then he's like, but I still have to play this fucking song. So, some of it, like the process of like going on the book tour and stuff is like that. I was like, wow, that relationship is over, or that period of my life of me like pining over that is gone. It's like, wow, but I still have to, talk about this book. So yeah, I mean, you become different people, and then sometimes like similar nerves are hit and similar, trauma, abandonment, like all sorts of things, like, and sometimes it'll come out of nowhere, and I'll be like right back there. And it's like, wow, that sucks. It's sort of the nature of being human, I think.
Yeah, it is interesting. When you're writing a memoir, you have to pick a time frame, right?
Yeah.
It can't be like 1 to 20, or I guess it could be, but like probably don't remember every year, and probably maybe 8 to 12 was not significant. Like you have to pick a time, but your reaction to that time changes because you change as an individual, yet you're still writing about a past version of you. Mm. That stays static, but you change.
Yeah.
So it'd be really interesting. Would you even write a book like this maybe 20 years from now?
I hope to not write another memoir ever again. I don't know, like I might, like it's a process. I think like maybe when I'm like 80 or something, I don't know. Or in my 60s, that seems far off. It's probably not as far off as I think. But yeah, a key portion of writing this book, and especially allowing it to be published, was developing compassion for those previous versions of myself that were going through difficult things, or having delayed reactions to really difficult things, or reacting perhaps to then present events as if it was a traumatizing event that had happened actually years before, or just not reacting well to the circumstances of my life, and having compassion for the person I was at like 12 and 19 and 24 and 29. Just, learning to deal with the fact that I myself was like not the younger self that I had anticipated being or really wanted to be, but that's who I was, and like that's okay. Like that has to be okay. And there's nothing I can do to change that anyway, so I might as well have compassion for myself. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out on behalf of Adrian, Military and Veteran Center. Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Towson University community coming out, participating in this event. I think I can speak safely for us with military affiliated identities or those working in this space. Always appreciate the opportunity to be included, be heard, make those connections. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this episode. If you'd like to learn more about other conversations that we have with other people on our campus, feel free to like and subscribe to this channel and be on the lookout for TU Today, because we'll be posting when each episode will be premiering on our channel as well. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.